Hello, and welcome back to the Crime Folio. Thank you for joining us as we delve into another complex case that challenges our perceptions of safety and trust. In the digital age, we build relationships through screens, often believing we are safe. But what happens when that trust is exploited? Today, we examine a case where online deception escalated into real-world tragedy. This is the story of a predator who turned a catfishing scheme into a deadly game, blurring the line between a virtual fantasy and a fatal reality. Case 1. The Talhotblond Triangle's Fatal Deception. The story does not begin with a crime. It begins, as many tragedies do, with a quiet and unremarkable life. In Western New York, in a small town where seasons dictate the rhythm of existence, lived Thomas Montgomery. To his neighbors, he was a family man, a husband to Cindy, a father to 2 daughters. At 47 years old, he had settled into the predictable cadence of middle age. He worked as a machinist at a Dynabraid factory, a job that required precision and patience, qualities he seemed to embody. He was a man who followed the rules, who provided for his family, who appeared to be content with his lot. But beneath the placid surface of this life, a deep and gnawing dissatisfaction was taking root. It was a loneliness that could not be articulated, a sense that his best years, his years of significance, were behind him. He had once been a Marine, a point of pride that had faded into a distant memory, overshadowed by the mundane reality of factory shifts and suburban obligations. The internet, for Thomas, was an escape hatch. It was a portal to a world where he could be someone else, someone more. In the anonymous expanse of online chat rooms, he was not a middle-aged machinist with a thickening waistline and a quiet home. He was Marine Sniper, a persona crafted from the most potent elements of his past and his imagination. He was 18 years old, a young, decorated soldier preparing for deployment to Iraq. He was strong, brave, and unburdened by the compromises of adulthood. He was the man he wished he had been, or perhaps the man he believed he still was, deep inside. In this digital ether, he met her. Her screen name was Talhotblond, a moniker that promised youth and beauty. Her avatar was a picture of a striking young woman with blonde hair and an enigmatic smile. Her name, she said, was Jessie. She was 18, a high school senior from West Virginia, a small-town girl with big dreams. Their connection was immediate and electric. In the sterile glow of the computer screen, they found a profound intimacy. They shared secrets they had never spoken aloud, confessed fears, and built a world for two, constructed entirely of text and pixels. For Thomas Montgomery, this was not a game. It was a lifeline. His days at the factory became a prelude to his nights with Jessie. His real life faded into a gray backdrop for the vibrant, technicolor fantasy he lived online. He would race home, retreat to the family computer in the basement, and transform. The tired machinist would recede, and Tommy, the young Marine, would emerge. He fell in love, not just with the idea of Jessie, but with the version of himself that existed only in her eyes. The deception deepened, spiraling into a complex web of lies. When Jessie asked for a picture, he did not send one of himself. He sent a photograph of his own youngest daughter, a girl who was, coincidentally, around the same age as his fabricated persona. He was now borrowing from the lives of his own family to feed the fantasy. The line between Thomas, the father, and Tommy, the lover, was beginning to erode. Their online relationship flourished for months. It was a courtship conducted through instant messages, a romance of keystrokes. They spoke of a future together, of the day he would return from his deployment, and they would finally meet. For Thomas, this future was a potent dream, a promise that kept the bleakness of his real life at bay. For the person behind the Talhotblond account, the nature of this dream was far more complicated. The woman behind the avatar was not an 18-year-old high school student named Jessie. Her name was Mary Sheeler. She was in her 40s, a mother living in West Virginia. Her life, much like Thomas's, was one of quiet frustration. She felt overlooked, trapped in the routines of her own domestic existence. The Talhotblond persona was her escape, too. The photograph she used as her avatar was not of herself, but of her own daughter, a girl named Jessie. Mary had stolen her daughter's identity to live out a fantasy of being young, desired, and free. It was a deception mirroring Thomas's own, a hall of mirrors where two lonely, middle-aged people pretended to be teenagers, using the images of their own children as masks. The digital world they had built, however, was about to be breached by a figure from the real one. At the Dynabraid factory, Thomas Montgomery worked alongside a young man named Brian Barrett. Brian was 22 years old. He was everything Thomas Montgomery was pretending to be. He was young, handsome, and at the beginning of his life, with a future full of potential. He was a hard worker, well-liked by his colleagues, a genuinely good person by all accounts. Thomas saw Brian not as a colleague, but as a rival, a physical embodiment of the lie he was living. A seed of resentment was planted, a subconscious envy that would soon find fertile ground. The catalyst for the tragedy was a simple, careless mistake. In his online conversations with Jessie, Thomas had mentioned his workplace. He had talked about his life in New York, grounding his fantasy in just enough reality to make it believable. Intrigued, or perhaps seeking to verify his story, Mary Sheeler, as Jessie, did a simple online search. She found the Dynabraid company website and looked through the employee directory. There, she found him, Brian Barrett. His photograph matched the youthful ideal she had in her mind. He was real. He was the age Tommy claimed to be. And he worked at the same factory. A new, more dangerous game began. Mary, still posing as the 18-year-old Jessie, reached out to Brian Barrett online. Brian, unaware of the sprawling deception that led her to his inbox, was flattered. He saw a beautiful young woman who seemed interested in him. He responded. They began to chat and, quickly, a genuine connection formed. Brian was smitten. He believed he was talking to Jessie, a teenager from West Virginia. He had no idea that she was the same Jessie, who was in a deeply emotional online relationship with his older coworker, Thomas Montgomery. And he certainly had no idea that the woman he was falling for was, in reality, a middle-aged mother using her daughter's pictures. Thomas Montgomery soon discovered the betrayal. He saw Talhotblond interacting with a new screen name, one he eventually traced back to Brian. The revelation was catastrophic. In his mind, the real-life embodiment of his fantasy self had stolen his fantasy girlfriend. The jealousy was not rational, it was primal. It was the rage of a man whose only source of light was being extinguished. The online world, his sanctuary, had been invaded. His two lives, which he had so carefully kept separate, were now colliding with devastating force. The love triangle became a vortex of obsession and manipulation. Mary Sheeler was at the center, skillfully playing all sides. She continued her relationship with Brian as Jessie, while simultaneously creating a new persona to interact with Thomas. She began posing as Jessie's mother, Mary, telling Thomas that her daughter was in trouble and that she needed his help to keep an eye on her. It was a breathtakingly cynical move. She was now using her own real name to further the deception, weaving a web so tangled that no one could see its full design. As Mary, she would feed Thomas's paranoia about Brian, confirming his worst fears. As Jessie, she would tell Brian that Tommy was a disturbed, older man who was stalking her online. Thomas Montgomery lost in this maze of lies, became unhinged. His online messages to Brian escalated from jealous rants to direct, violent threats. He wrote as Marine Sniper, the soldier, threatening to eliminate the man who had stolen his love. He told Brian he would be waiting for him in the parking lot, that he would make him pay. Brian Barrett was caught in the middle. He was confused and increasingly frightened. He reported the threats to his supervisors at Dynabraid. He showed them the messages. The company took it seriously, speaking to both men. Thomas Montgomery was given a stern warning. He feigned compliance, promising to stop. But in his mind, the conflict was no longer about online drama. It had become a matter of honor, a battle he, as Marine Sniper, had to win. He believed that Jesse still loved him and that Brian was a physical obstacle that needed to be removed. The day of the murder was unremarkable. It was a Thursday in September. Thomas Montgomery went to work, performed his duties with his usual precision, and clocked out at the end of his shift. But he did not go home. He drove his minivan to a section of the company parking lot that was not well lit, a place that offered a clear view of the entrance Brian Barrett used. And then he waited. For over an hour, he sat in the driver's seat, the engine off, the quiet hum of his rage filling the small space. He had a .38 caliber pistol with him, a weapon he had brought from home. When Brian Barrett emerged from the factory, his workday over, he walked toward his pickup truck, likely thinking of the weekend ahead, perhaps thinking of the girl from West Virginia he hoped to one day meet. He was oblivious to the danger that waited in the shadows. Thomas Montgomery got out of his van, his movements calm and deliberate. He called out Brian's name. As Brian turned, Thomas raised the pistol and fired. He shot Brian Barrett 3 times at close range. 1 bullet to the head, 2 to the torso. There was no struggle, no final confrontation. It was a cold, swift execution. Thomas Montgomery got back into his minivan and drove away, leaving Brian Barrett to die alone on the cold asphalt of the factory parking lot. The initial police investigation was straightforward. A workplace shooting. The primary suspect was the coworker with whom the victim had a known dispute. The threats Brian had reported made Thomas Montgomery the immediate and obvious person of interest. Detectives went to his home that same night. When confronted, Thomas confessed almost immediately. He told them he had shot Brian Barrett. He led them to the murder weapon, which he had hidden. To the police, it seemed like an open and shut case of workplace violence fueled by a grudge. But as they dug deeper, the motive seemed bizarrely thin. A fight over a girl online? It didn't seem to warrant such a brutal, premeditated act. The true, staggering complexity of the case was only revealed when investigators seized the computers. They found the chat logs, thousands upon thousands of messages that chronicled the entire affair. They read the love notes from Tommy to Jesse. They read the venomous threats from Marine Sniper to Brian. And they began to unravel the multiple identities of Talhotblond. The turning point came when they contacted the person they believed to be the girl at the center of it all, the real Jessie Sheeler. When they spoke to her, the final, shocking piece of the puzzle fell into place. Jessie, a teenager in West Virginia, was bewildered. She knew nothing of Thomas Montgomery or Brian Barrett. She told police that her mother, Mary, was often on the computer and that she had, on occasion, taken pictures from her daughter's social media accounts. The investigators had to process a stunning reality. The beautiful 18-year-old girl at the heart of this fatal love triangle did not exist. She was a fiction, a puppet. The puppeteer was her mother, Mary Sheeler, a 45-year-old woman who had orchestrated the entire tragedy from the safety of her living room, hundreds of miles away. When questioned by police, Mary Sheeler admitted to the deception. She claimed it had started as a game, a way to feel young and attractive again. She expressed remorse, but her role in the events was undeniable. She had not pulled the trigger, but she had loaded the gun. She had pitted two men against each other, fanning the flames of jealousy and rage for her own emotional gratification, with no apparent regard for the real-world consequences. Thomas Montgomery was charged with first-degree murder. His defense argued for extreme emotional disturbance, claiming that the psychological manipulation he endured at the hands of Mary Sheeler had caused him to snap. The prosecution argued that it was a calculated, premeditated act of violence. The jury agreed. They found him guilty, and he was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. In the courtroom, he was no longer Marine Sniper. He was once again Thomas Montgomery, a broken, middle-aged man facing the catastrophic consequences of his fantasy life. And Mary Sheeler? She was never charged with a crime. Legally, she had committed no offense. Lying online, no matter how maliciously, was not illegal. She had not incited the murder in a way that met the legal standard for culpability. She walked away a free woman, her identity eventually exposed to the world, but with no legal price to pay for the death she had set in motion. She became a ghost in the narrative, a cautionary tale about the unaccountability of online actions. The case of the Talhotblond triangle is a profound and disturbing examination of identity in the digital age. It reveals how easily the lines between reality and fantasy can blur, and how the anonymity of the internet can unleash the darkest aspects of human nature. Two lonely people, seeking to escape the quiet disappointments of their lives, created false identities. But their shared delusion did not remain contained within their computer screens. It spilled out into the real world and consumed an innocent third party. Brian Barrett was not a character in a game. He was a son, a friend, a young man with a life full of promise. He was killed not because of anything he had done, but because of who two strangers were pretending to be. He died in a parking lot because a 47-year-old man believed he was an 18-year-old soldier fighting for the love of an 18-year-old girl who was, in fact, a 45-year-old woman. His death serves as a stark and tragic reminder that behind every screen name, every avatar, there is a real person. And sometimes, the games we play online have the most devastating real-world stakes. Case 2. The Mountain Murders of Facebook Fantasy. In the secluded valleys of the Appalachian Mountains lies Mountain City, Tennessee. It is a place defined by its geography, a town nestled in a landscape of imposing beauty and profound isolation. Life here moves at a different pace, governed by tradition and tight-knit community bonds where everyone knows everyone else's business, and family legacy is a currency of its own. It was in this environment that the Potter family lived, a unit that appeared, from the outside, to be defined by fierce loyalty and protection. The patriarch was Marvin Potter, known to everyone as Buddy. He was a former Marine and a Vietnam veteran, a man whose worldview had been forged in conflict and who carried the quiet, unyielding authority of a soldier. His wife, Barbara Potter, was his devoted partner, a woman whose life revolved around her husband and, most intensely, their daughter. Their daughter was Janelle Potter. In her late 20s and early 30s, Janelle was, in many ways, an adult child. Living at home, largely unemployed, and suffering from type 1 diabetes, she was the object of her parents' suffocating concern. They saw her as fragile, vulnerable, a perpetual victim in a world that did not understand her. Janelle, in turn, inhabited this role completely. Sheltered from the normal hardships and social negotiations of adulthood, she developed a worldview that was profoundly insular and self-referential. Her social skills were underdeveloped, and she struggled to maintain friendships. The world outside the Potter home felt hostile and judgmental. Her refuge, Her entire social universe was online. On Facebook, Janelle Potter was not the isolated, awkward woman her neighbors might see at the local grocery store. She was a vibrant, popular, and desirable figure. She carefully curated an image of a life filled with friends, admirers, and drama. It was a reality built on a foundation of likes, comments, and friend requests, a world where she held absolute control. But this digital world was also where her real-life grievances were amplified, distorted, and ultimately weaponized. The conflict began, as it often does, with a simple social fallout. Janelle had befriended a young couple, Billie Jean Hayworth and Billy Clay Payne Jr. Billie Jean was pretty and outgoing, and Billy Payne was a friendly, well-liked young man. For a time, they were part of Janelle's small, real-world social circle. They spent time together, took photos, and engaged in the mundane rituals of small-town friendship. But the friendship soured. Accounts differ on the exact cause. Janelle claimed they began to bully her, both online and off. They and their friends claimed that Janelle became possessive and strange, misinterpreting friendly interactions as romantic interest and reacting with anger when rebuffed. Whatever the initial spark, the result was a definitive social schism. Janelle was out. Billie Jean and Billy Payne, along with their wider circle of friends, unfriended her on Facebook. In the closed ecosystem of Mountain City, and for someone as socially dependent as Janelle, this was not a minor slight. It was a declaration of war. The digital unfriending was a public shaming, an exile from the only social sphere where she felt she had any standing. In the isolation of her bedroom, staring into the glow of her monitor, Janelle's resentment began to fester and mutate. The perceived slights morphed into a campaign of terror. A negative comment was not just an insult. It was a threat. A blocked profile was not a social snub. It was an act of aggression. She began meticulously documenting every perceived wrong, screenshotting comments and logging interactions. She presented this portfolio of grievances to her parents, Buddy and Barbara. To them, their daughter's digital narrative was indistinguishable from reality. They saw what she showed them, a relentless stream of harassment targeting their fragile child. They did not see the context, the nuance, or Janelle's own role in the disputes. They saw a daughter under siege, and their protective instincts, already dialed to an extreme, went into overdrive. The Potter home transformed into a fortress, a command center for a war that only they believed was being waged. The deception, however, required reinforcement. Janelle's own claims of persecution were not enough. She needed an outside authority, a powerful, objective voice to validate her narrative and justify the escalating paranoia within her family. And so, from the depths of her imagination, she created him. His name was Chris. According to the Facebook profile Janelle meticulously constructed, Chris was a CIA agent. He was handsome, mysterious, and deeply concerned for Janelle's safety. He was everything she wanted in a protector, powerful, anonymous, and completely under her control. Janelle began communicating with her own mother, Barbara, through Chris's fake profile. Chris would send Barbara messages, warning her that Janelle was in grave danger. He would claim to be monitoring the situation from Langley, Virginia, confirming that the threats from Billie Jean Hayworth and Billy Payne were real and credible. He told the Potters that these small-town youths were part of a larger, more dangerous conspiracy. He advised them, as a supposed government agent, to take matters into their own hands, because the local police were compromised or incompetent. It was a masterstroke of manipulation. By creating an external, authoritative phantom, Janelle removed any doubt her parents might have had. They were no longer just acting on their daughter's emotional claims. They were acting on intelligence from the CIA. Their paranoia was no longer a family eccentricity. It was a patriot's response to a confirmed threat. The fantasy was further complicated by the arrival of Jamie Curd. Curd was a quiet man in his 30s who worked at a local paper mill. He had developed a romantic infatuation with Janelle. He was drawn to her perceived vulnerability and saw himself as her knight in shining armor. Janelle cultivated this devotion, feeding him the same narrative of persecution she had fed her parents. Jamie, like Buddy and Barbara, was brought into the inner circle and introduced to the looming presence of Chris, the CIA agent. He, too, began receiving messages from the fictitious operative, urging him to protect Janelle at all costs. He believed it all. He was in love, and he was being guided by a secret agent. His purpose was clear. The Potter household became a pressure cooker of shared delusion. The four of them, Buddy, Barbara, Janelle, and Jamie, were caught in a feedback loop of fear and rage, all of it orchestrated by Janelle and her digital puppet, Chris. They believed they were targets. They spoke of the enemy. They held councils of war in their living room, poring over Janelle's screenshots of Facebook comments as if they were enemy communiques. Buddy Potter, the old Marine, began to speak of a mission. The threat, they decided, had to be neutralized. By this time, Billie Jean Hayworth and Billy Payne were living their own lives, largely oblivious to the obsessive, murderous fantasy building around them. They had moved on. They had a new baby, a son named Tyler. Their world was one of diapers and late-night feedings, of the simple joys and struggles of young parenthood. They had no idea that in a house just a few miles away, their names were being spoken like a death sentence. On January 31st, 2012, the fantasy demanded blood. Buddy Potter and Jamie Curd decided to act. According to later testimony, Barbara helped them prepare, wiping down the ammunition to remove fingerprints. Janelle remained at home, the architect of the operation, monitoring from her digital command post. Buddy, the veteran, took the lead. He and Jamie Curd got into Curd's vehicle and drove to the home where Billy Payne and Billie Jean Hayworth lived. The scene that followed was one of swift, pitiless violence. Billy Payne was outside, near his shed. He was confronted and shot dead. The killers then moved to the house. Inside, Billie Jean Hayworth was in a bedroom, holding her 7-month-old son. She was shot once, in the head. She fell, her body instinctively cradling the infant, protecting him even in death. The killers then fled, leaving a scene of unimaginable horror. The discovery was made hours later by Billie Jean's father, who had come to check on the young family. He found Billy Payne's body outside. Frantic, he ran into the house, where he found his daughter, murdered. And in her arms, covered in her blood but physically unharmed, was his grandson, Tyler. The image would haunt the community forever. A baby, alive, cradled by his dead mother. The Johnson County Sheriff's Office launched an immediate, intensive investigation. A double homicide in a quiet community like Mountain City was a seismic event. Initially, there were few leads. The crimes seemed senseless. But whispers soon began to circulate about the long-running feud, the bad blood between the victims and the Potter family. Investigators started looking into the claims of harassment that Janelle had so publicly broadcasted. They interviewed Janelle, Buddy, and Barbara. The Potters presented themselves as victims who had been living in fear. They showed the police their files of screenshots, their evidence of the cyberbullying. They spoke of the threats they had endured. It was a compelling performance, but detectives were skeptical. The level of violence seemed utterly disproportionate to a Facebook squabble. The investigation turned, as it so often does, to the digital world. Sheriff's Department investigators, with the help of the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, began a deep dive into the online activity surrounding the case. They analyzed the Facebook profiles involved in the alleged harassment, and they made a critical discovery. The IP addressed the unique digital signature of a computer's location for many of the threatening messages sent to Janelle, and most damningly, the IP address for Chris, the heroic CIA agent, all traced back to a single location, the Potter family home. The web of lies collapsed. Chris, the CIA agent, was not in Langley. He was in Janelle Potter's bedroom. The elaborate narrative of persecution was a fabrication, a phantom built to justify murder. Investigators now understood they were not dealing with a simple case of retaliation. They were dealing with a complex, premeditated conspiracy rooted in a shared, manufactured reality. Jamie Curd was the first to break. Faced with the digital evidence, his fantasy shattered. He confessed to his role in the murders, implicating Buddy Potter as the triggerman. He laid out the entire conspiracy, detailing the meetings, the planning, and the central, manipulative role played by Janelle and her fake online persona. Buddy and Barbara Potter were arrested. Janelle, the mastermind, was taken into custody. The town of Mountain City was left to grapple with the shocking truth. This was not a crime of passion or a random act of violence. It was a carefully orchestrated execution, planned and incited by a young woman who had convinced her own family to kill for her. The trials were a spectacle of familial dysfunction and digital delusion. Barbara Potter, in a plea deal, testified against her own husband and daughter, laying bare the paranoid world they had all inhabited. She received a sentence of 25 years. Jamie Curd also testified for the prosecution and was sentenced to 25 years. Buddy Potter and Janelle Potter were tried together. The prosecution portrayed Buddy as the willing soldier and Janelle as the cold, calculating general. The defense argued that Janelle lived in a delusional world and that Buddy was a father pushed to the brink by threats against his child. The jury saw it differently. They saw a conspiracy. Both Buddy and Janelle Potter were found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. They were each sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences. The Mountain murders stand as a chilling testament to the dangers of a curated reality. Janelle Potter was not a catfish in the traditional sense. She did not deceive a lover for money or emotional sport. Instead, she used the tools of online deception to radicalize her own family. She created an echo chamber where her grievances were the only news, her fears were the only facts, and a fictional CIA agent was the only authority. She built a world for her parents and her admirer to live in, and in that world, murder was not a crime. It was a righteous necessity. The ultimate tragedy belongs to Billie Jean Hayworth and Billy Clay Payne Jr., 2 young people whose lives were extinguished over a conflict that was little more than a ghost. They were killed by a veteran soldier and his accomplice on the orders of a woman who wielded Facebook as a weapon. And in the silent aftermath, a baby was left an orphan, his life forever marked by a fantasy that became fatally real. Their story is a harrowing warning that the most dangerous online predators are sometimes the ones who are closest to us, who look us in the eye every day and tell us a story we desperately want to believe. Case 3. The Grooming of Breck Bednar. The story of Breck Bednar is not one that involves financial scams or romantic deception in the typical sense of catfishing. It is a darker, more insidious form of online predation, one that highlights the vulnerability of youth and the sophisticated, patient evil that can flourish in the hidden corners of the internet. It is a story about the grooming of a child, not for exploitation, but for extermination. Breck Bednar was, by all accounts, a bright and happy 14-year-old boy. Living in the quiet, affluent town of Caterham, Surrey, in England, he was part of a close-knit, loving family. His mother, Lauren Lefebvre, an American-born oil futures analyst, and his father, Barry Bednar, a shipping consultant, provided him and his younger triplet siblings with a comfortable, stable home. Breck was intelligent, a student at a good school, and a member of the Air Cadets. He was kind, well-liked, and had a passion that consumed most of his free time: online gaming. Like millions of teenagers around the world, Breck found a community and a sense of purpose in the virtual landscapes of multiplayer games. His world was one of servers, headsets, and avatars. He was part of a small, international group of friends who met online to play games like Battlefield 4. They communicated through voice chat platforms like TeamSpeak and Skype, their friendships existing entirely through audio and text, mediated by the game they were playing. For Breck and his parents, this seemed like a normal, harmless teenage pastime. It was a hobby that kept him at home, seemingly safe under their roof. Within this small gaming circle, one member stood out. His name, he said, was Louis Daines. He was older, claiming to be 18, and presented himself as a knowledgeable and charismatic leader. To the younger boys in the group, including Breck, Louis was an impressive figure. He was confident, articulate, and seemed to have a deep understanding of computers, programming, and even international business. He claimed to work in the lucrative field of software engineering, boasting of wealth and success that seemed impossibly glamorous to a group of teenage boys. Louis Daines took a special interest in Breck. He singled him out, offering him advice, complimenting his gaming skills, and slowly, methodically, drawing him into a private, one-on-one relationship. This relationship began within the group chat, but soon migrated to private messages, away from the ears of the other boys. Louis became Breck's mentor, his confidant, his online big brother. Lauren Lefebvre, Breck's mother, was not entirely comfortable with the situation. She was a vigilant parent, aware of the potential dangers of the internet. She had rules: no sleepovers at the homes of people met online, and she needed to know who he was talking to. She found the intensity of Breck's online friendship with this older boy unsettling. She heard the voice of Louis coming through Breck's headset, a voice that sounded mature, commanding. She worried about the power imbalance, the influence this unseen stranger held over her son. Her concerns deepened as Louis's influence began to manifest in Breck's behavior. Breck, once open and communicative, became more secretive. He started to parrot Louis's opinions, many of which were misogynistic and controlling. Louis began to systematically poison Breck's mind against his own family. He told Breck that his parents didn't understand him, that they were holding him back. He fabricated elaborate lies, claiming that he, Louis, was part of a secretive and powerful online syndicate that could offer Breck a future his parents could never provide. He spun tales of a business he was running, promising to make Breck rich and successful if he would just trust him. The manipulation was subtle and masterful. Louis used a classic grooming technique: isolation. He began to turn Breck against his real-world friends and even his online gaming friends, convincing him that they were jealous or untrustworthy. He created a world in which Louis was the only person Breck could truly rely on. The online gaming server, once a shared space, became Louis's kingdom, and Breck was his chosen apprentice. Lauren Lefebvre's maternal alarm bells were now screaming. She argued with Breck about the amount of time he spent talking to Louis. She tried to set limits, but Breck, under Louis's spell, saw her concern as control. He accused her of being paranoid, of trying to ruin his friendship and his future career. In one heated argument, Lauren demanded that Breck end the contact. Breck refused. Desperate, Lauren did something many parents would do. She called the police. She reported her concerns to the Surrey police, explaining that she believed an older man was grooming her son online. She feared sexual exploitation. The police recorded her concerns, But as there was no immediate evidence of a specific crime being committed in their jurisdiction, the response was limited. No formal action was taken that could have severed the connection. The predator, Louis Daines, was aware of the family's opposition. He used it to his advantage. He presented himself to Breck as a fellow victim of misunderstanding parents. He fostered a sense of us against the world, solidifying his bond with the boy. The grooming entered its final, fatal phase. Louis began to orchestrate a real-world meeting. He invited Breck to come to his flat in Grays, Essex, a town about 30 miles from Breck's home. He presented the invitation not as a casual get-together, but as a business opportunity. He told Breck that he was going to hand over the reins of his lucrative online business to him. He needed to meet in person to finalize the details. To make the story more plausible, he invented a fictional third-party another boy who was supposedly also coming to the meeting. This made the prospect of traveling to a stranger's home seem less intimidating. It was a group event, a professional handover. Breck, completely ensnared, was ecstatic. This was the culmination of everything Louis had promised. He pleaded with his parents to let him go. They, of course, refused. The idea of their 14-year-old son traveling alone to meet a stranger he knew only online was unthinkable. But Breck was determined. On the weekend of February 16, 2014, he lied to his family. He told them he was going for a sleepover at the home of a local friend, a boy his parents knew and trusted. It was a credible lie, one that would give him the cover he needed. He packed a small bag and, on the morning of Sunday, February 17th, he left his home. He did not go to his friend's house. He walked to the train station and bought a ticket to Essex. His mother grew suspicious later that day when she contacted the friend's father, who informed her that Breck was not there and that there had been no plan for a sleepover. Panic set in. Lauren immediately knew where Breck had gone. She called his mobile phone, but it went straight to voicemail. She and Barry reported Breck missing to the police, telling them exactly where they believed he was, at the home of Louis Daines in Grays. The family frantically searched online for an address, piecing together clues from Breck's digital life. While his family was desperately trying to find him, Breck arrived at Louis Daines' flat. The reality of the situation must have been a jarring shock. The charismatic, wealthy software tycoon he had idolized online was, in reality, Louis Daines, an unemployed 18-year-old living in a small, messy apartment. The glamorous world he had described was a complete fabrication. There was no business to hand over. There was no other boy coming to the meeting. There was only Louis Daines. What exactly happened inside that flat is known only from Daines' later confession. The confrontation that must have occurred, Breck's realization of the deception, his likely fear and desire to leave was met with brutal violence. Louis Daines attacked Breck Bednar, binding him with duct tape. He then subjected him to what police would later describe as a sadistic assault before murdering him with a knife, inflicting a fatal wound to the neck. After the murder, Louis Daines did something chillingly detached. He went back online. Using Breck's mobile phone, he sent messages to Breck's online gaming friends, posing as Breck, telling them that he had left and would not be coming back. Then, he took photos of Breck's body and sent them to several people online, including some of the members of their gaming group. The images were gruesome, undeniable proof of what had happened. It was a final, horrific act of control, a broadcast of his ultimate triumph. A few hours later, Louis Daines himself called the police. In a calm, emotionless voice, he told the emergency operator, "I'm just going to inform you that a death has occurred." He went on to explain that he had a fight with his friend and that the friend was dead. When police and paramedics arrived at the flat in Grays, they found Breck Bednar's body. Louis Daines was arrested at the scene. The investigation that followed was a grim portrait of meticulous, predatory grooming. The police uncovered the vast digital trail of communication between Lewis and Breck. They saw how Danes had patiently and systematically dismantled Breck's support systems, isolated him from his family, and lured him into a trap. The motive, prosecutors would later argue, was rooted in a sadistic desire for control and power, with clear sexual and violent undertones. Danes had created a fantasy world, and when Breck, upon seeing the bleak reality, likely tried to reject it, Danes responded with homicidal rage. He could not allow his creation to walk away. Lewis Danes initially tried to claim self-defense, concocting a story that he and Breck had gotten into a fight. But the evidence was overwhelming. The binding, the nature of the wounds, and his own actions after the murder pointed to a calculated, sadistic killing. Faced with the mountain of evidence, he eventually pleaded guilty to murder. In court, he was revealed not as a tech mogul, but as a deeply disturbed and manipulative young man with a history of fabricating online personas. He was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 25 years. The murder of Breck Bednar sent shockwaves through the UK and beyond. It was a case that starkly illustrated a new, terrifying dimension of online danger. The predator was not a shadowy figure in a distant country, but a teenager in the next county, using the very platforms designed for social connection as a hunting ground. In the aftermath, Lauren Lefebvre, Breck's mother, channeled her unimaginable grief into advocacy. She founded the Breck Foundation, a charity dedicated to educating young people, parents, and teachers about the dangers of online grooming. She shares Breck's story relentlessly, not to frighten, but to empower. Her message is clear. Parents must be involved in their children's online lives. They must trust their instincts, and they must understand that the threat of grooming is not limited to sexual exploitation. It can be a psychological game of control that can escalate to violence. Breck's story is a profound and heartbreaking lesson. It teaches us that the most dangerous catfishing isn't about stealing money or breaking a heart. It's about stealing a life. It demonstrates how a predator can build a world of lies so compelling that a smart, loved, and protected child can be convinced to walk away from everything he knows and step into his own grave. Breck Bednar was not a victim of a random act of violence. He was the target of a long, patient, and deliberate campaign of psychological warfare, waged by a killer who saw him not as a person, but as a character in a game he was determined to win. Case 4. The Dexter Killer's Online Audition. The city of Edmonton, Alberta, in Canada, is a sprawling northern metropolis, a place of cold, long winters and a practical, hard-working populace. It was here, in the autumn of 2008, that a series of events began that would blur the lines between dark fiction and even darker reality, culminating in a case that would be forever linked to a popular television show about a serial killer who kills other killers. But the real-life predator at the heart of this story was not targeting vigilantes. He was using the tools of online dating to cast his own real-life horror film, with an unsuspecting man as his lead victim. The story begins with Mark Twitchell, a man in his late 20s who, on the surface, seemed to be living a conventional, aspirational life. He was married, a new father, and had a steady job. But these trappings of normalcy were a thin veneer over a burning, all-consuming ambition. Mark Twitchell wanted to be a filmmaker, not just a hobbyist, but a visionary director in the vein of his idols, like George Lucas and the creators of the Saw franchise. He had invested time and money into this dream, producing a low-budget Star Wars fan film and tirelessly networking within Edmonton's small film community. He saw himself as a creative genius on the cusp of greatness, a man whose artistic vision was simply misunderstood by a world not yet ready for his talent. In the fall of 2008, Twitchell was working on a new project, a short horror film titled House of Cards. The plot was grim. A man is lured to a location by a woman he met online, only to be captured by a masked killer who tortures him for his password information. It was a derivative but dark concept, one that Twitchell seemed particularly obsessed with. He had rented a detached garage in a residential neighborhood, converting it into a makeshift film studio. He called it his kill room. It was meticulously prepared for the film shoot, with plastic sheeting covering the walls and floor, and a collection of props including restraints, knives, and a stun baton. Twitchell's preferred method for connecting with people, both for his film projects and socially, was the internet. He was an avid user of social media and online dating websites. In early October 2008, he created a fake profile on the popular dating site Plenty of Fish. Posing as a woman named Sheena, he used an attractive photo and a compelling backstory to lure men. His goal, he would later claim, was research for his film. He wanted to see how easy it would be to convince a man to meet a stranger at an isolated location. His first target was a man named Gillis Tatro. Tatro, intrigued by Sheena, agreed to meet her at the address Twitchell provided, the garage film studio. When Tatro arrived, he found the garage door open and followed the instructions he'd been given to enter. The moment he stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind him. He was plunged into darkness. Suddenly, a man in a hockey mask jumped out, brandishing a stun baton. A violent struggle ensued. The attacker zapped Tatro with the stun gun, but Tatro, fueled by adrenaline, fought back fiercely. He managed to grab the attacker's weapon, disarm him, and miraculously escape, running for his life through the quiet suburban streets. Shaken and confused, Tatro did not immediately go to the police. The experience was so bizarre, so surreal, that he struggled to process it. He thought perhaps it was a prank, a mugging gone wrong, or something he had stumbled into by mistake. He tried to put the terrifying incident behind him. He had no idea that he had just escaped from a real-life audition for murder, and that his attacker, Mark Twitchell, was now frustrated and determined to perfect his script. For Twitchell, the failed attack was a learning experience. His kill room had not performed as expected. His victim had been too strong, his methods not effective enough. He needed to refine his technique. He returned to his online casting call, his macabre screenplay still unfinished. A week later, on October 10, 2008, another man, 38-year-old Johnny Altinger, was scrolling through Plenty of Fish. He was a computer technician, a single man looking for a connection. He came across a profile for a woman named Jen. The profile was compelling, and after a few email exchanges, Jen gave him directions to her place for a date. The address she provided was the same detached garage where Gillis Tatro had been attacked just days earlier. Johnny Altinger, excited for his date, told his friends about his plans. He sent one friend the directions Jen had given him, a seemingly minor act of caution that would later prove to be a crucial piece of evidence. On that Friday evening, he drove his red Mazda 3 to the designated address, and, just as Tatro had done, he walked into the garage. This time, however, the victim did not escape. What happened inside that garage was detailed in a document that would later shock investigators and the public alike. It was a diary, a script, found on Twitchell's laptop, titled SK Confessions, short for Serial Killer Confessions. The document, written from the perspective of a fictional killer, described in chilling, step-by-step detail the murder of a man lured via an online dating site. It was a parallel narrative to the plot of House of Cards, but this version was not fiction. It was a blueprint and a confession. According to the document, when Johnny Altinger entered the garage, he was attacked by Mark Twitchell, again wearing a hockey mask. Twitchell struck him with a heavy pipe. A brutal struggle followed, but this time, Twitchell was prepared. He overpowered Altinger, stabbing him repeatedly with a large hunting knife. He then dragged the dying man onto a makeshift operating table and began to dismember the body. It was a process he described with cold, clinical detachment, noting the challenges and the unexpected realities of such a grisly task. The document read like a filmmaker's production notes, critiquing his own performance in the act of murder. In the days that followed, Mark Twitchell engaged in a bizarre and elaborate cover-up. He began to impersonate his victim. He sent emails from Altinger's account to his friends and his employer, claiming that he had met a wonderful woman named Jen and had run away with her to Costa Rica for a long vacation. The goal was to create a plausible reason for Altinger's sudden disappearance, buying Twitchell time to dispose of the evidence. He even drove Altinger's car to a different location to make it seem as though he had left from somewhere else. But Altinger's friends were immediately suspicious. The tone of the emails was wrong. It didn't sound like Johnny. The story about running away with a woman he had just met seemed completely out of character for their responsible, practical friend. They were also troubled by the fact that he had not contacted his family. They banded together and reported him missing to the Edmonton Police Service. The investigation began with the last known piece of information, the directions to his date that Altinger had emailed to his friend. When police arrived at the location, they found the detached garage. They contacted the owner of the property, who told them he was renting the garage to an aspiring filmmaker named Mark Twitchell. The pieces began to click into place. When detectives brought Mark Twitchell in for questioning, he was calm, cooperative, and portrayed himself as an innocent artist who was being unfairly targeted. He admitted that the garage was his film set. He claimed that Johnny Altinger had indeed shown up for a date with a woman and that he, Twitchell, had seen Altinger leave with her, happy and unharmed. He explained that the kill room setup was merely for his movie, House of Cards, and that any similarity to the disappearance was a bizarre and unfortunate coincidence. The detectives were not convinced. They secured a warrant to search the garage. Underneath the veneer of a film set, they found microscopic traces of human blood. DNA testing confirmed it belonged to Johnny Altinger. They also searched Twitchell's car and found a laptop. On that laptop, they discovered the SK Confessions document. Reading the file was a horrifying moment for the investigators. They realized they were not just reading a fictional story. They were reading the killer's diary, a detailed account of how Johnny Altinger was lured, murdered, and dismembered. The document described how the killer dumped the victim's remains in a city sewer. Acting on this grotesque guide, police located the sewer manhole described in the file. Inside, they found the dismembered remains of Johnny Altinger. The investigation also led them to Gillis Tatro, the man who had escaped. When police showed Tatro a photo of Mark Twitchell, he confirmed that he was his attacker. The story he told them matched the first, failed attack described in the SK Confessions document. The police now had a survivor, a confession, and the victim's body. The case against Mark Twitchell was overwhelming. The trial was a media sensation. The prosecution argued that Mark Twitchell was a wannabe serial killer who had become obsessed with the television show Dexter. The show features a protagonist who is a blood spatter analyst by day and a vigilante serial killer by night, often dismembering his victims and disposing of their bodies. The prosecution contended that Twitchell was not just inspired by fiction, he was attempting to live it. The SK Confessions document was not a work of art, but a literal script for murder. Twitchell's defense was audacious. His lawyers argued that he was not a killer, but an artist who had gone to extreme lengths for his craft. They claimed that the SK Confessions document was indeed a work of fiction and that Altinger's death was a tragic accident, an act of self-defense gone horribly wrong during an elaborate hoax designed to create publicity for his film. Twitchell himself took the stand, delivering a performance in which he admitted to the online lore and the dismemberment, but insisted the killing itself was unintentional. The jury did not believe him. They saw through the performance. The level of premeditation, the detailed planning evident in the document, and the testimony of the man who escaped all pointed to a cold, calculated predator. In 2011, Mark Twitchell was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. The case of the Dexter Killer, as he became known, is a chilling exploration of a mind where the boundary between artistic fantasy and violent reality completely dissolved. Mark Twitchell used the anonymity and trust inherent in online dating not for romance or connection, but as a casting tool. He was not just catfishing for an emotional response, he was catfishing for a body. His victims were not marks to be scammed, but characters to be written out of existence. Johnny Altinger died because he answered a dating ad, believing in the possibility of meeting someone new. Instead, he walked into the final scene of a horror film, directed by a man who is both the writer and the monster. His story is a grim reminder that behind a seemingly harmless online profile can lurk a predator whose deadliest game is the one they are playing in their own mind. Case 5. The Poison Sympathy of Hope Ibarra. Not all online predators hunt for lovers or victims for a physical thrill. Some hunt for something far more ephemeral, yet just as addictive: sympathy. They are emotional vampires, and their predation is a slow, insidious drain, not just on their audience, but on the real people they use as props in their meticulously crafted narratives of suffering. This is the story of a mother who turned her child into a character in her tragic online drama and who is willing to poison her own daughter to keep the story going. In the suburbs of Fort Worth, Texas, Hope Ibarra cultivated a powerful online presence. To her followers on her blog and social media, she was a figure of tragic heroism. She was a loving wife and mother who was bravely battling a host of devastating illnesses. She claimed to suffer from advanced muscular dystrophy, which confined her to a wheelchair. She spoke of a harrowing battle with terminal cancer. Her life, as she presented it, was a constant struggle against a body that was failing her, a daily performance of courage in the face of insurmountable odds. Her online community responded with an outpouring of support. They sent messages of encouragement, offered prayers, and donated money to help with her supposed medical expenses. They saw her as an inspiration. Hope bathed in this attention. It was her validation, her purpose. The sympathy she received was a potent drug, and she was a profound addict. She organized her life around maintaining this narrative, her every post a carefully constructed performance of a woman on the brink. The problem, however, was that it was all a lie. Hope Ibarra did not have cancer. She did not have muscular dystrophy. Medical examinations would later show she was a perfectly healthy woman. Her life as a tragic patient was a complete and total fabrication. But a lie of this magnitude requires constant fuel. Over time, the novelty of her own illnesses began to wear thin. A narrative needs progression, new acts, and rising stakes to keep an audience engaged. Hope needed a new tragedy, something more immediate, more heartbreaking, to secure the flow of sympathy she so desperately craved. And she found her new central character in her own home. Her youngest daughter began to get sick. At first, the ailments were strange and difficult to diagnose. She suffered from severe, unexplained allergic reactions. She had trouble breathing and was plagued by constant infections. Hope, the devoted mother, chronicled every symptom, every doctor's visit, every terrifying late-night trip to the emergency room. Her online persona seamlessly shifted from the brave patient to the heroic mother, now fighting not for her own life, but for the life of her precious, fragile child. The online community was captivated. The story had a new, more powerful emotional core. The sympathy, the prayers, and the donations intensified. Hope was no longer just a victim. She was a saint, a mother bearing an impossible cross. She posted photos of her daughter in hospital beds, frail and connected to machines. She wrote long, emotional posts detailing her fears that she would outlive her own child. She was the star of a tragedy that her followers believed was unfolding in real time. For the doctors at Cook Children's Medical Center in Fort Worth, the case was a baffling and frustrating puzzle. The girl was genuinely, terribly ill. She underwent numerous painful tests, invasive procedures, and was prescribed a cocktail of powerful medications. Yet no one could pinpoint a cause. Her symptoms would flare up unpredictably. She seemed to get worse while under her mother's direct care. She once had a severe anaphylactic reaction that doctors concluded could only have been caused by ingesting something, yet no one could figure out what. The girl, only a child, endured years of this medical torture, believing, as children do, that her mother was her greatest protector. The truth was a secret of unimaginable cruelty. Hope Ibarra was intentionally making her daughter sick. She was the cause of all of it. To create the symptoms of cystic fibrosis, she would take samples of her other children's saliva and phlegm and inject them into her daughter's feeding tube and respiratory ports. To trigger the severe allergic reactions, she would feed her daughter meticulously controlled amounts of drain cleaner and other caustic substances. She was slowly, systematically poisoning her own child and then presenting the results to a captivated online audience for validation. It was Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a rare but horrific form of abuse where a caregiver fabricates or induces illness in a person under their care to gain attention and sympathy. But Hope Ibarra's case was a distinctly 21st century variant. The internet provided her with an unprecedentedly large and responsive audience. Her blog and social media were not just an outlet, they were a stage. She was not just seeking sympathy from a few doctors or family members, she was commanding it from a global community. This feedback loop praise became the central rhythm of her life. The breaking point came when the child was about 8 years old. A team of doctors and nurses at Cook Children's, led by a physician who had long been suspicious, began to put the pieces together. They noted that the girl's health seemed to miraculously improve whenever her mother was not present. They reviewed the history of her bizarre symptoms, which defied all known medical logic. They decided to take a drastic step. They separated mother and child and placed the girl under covert surveillance in the hospital. They also began to test for substances that had no business being in a child's body. At the same time, the family's pediatrician, also deeply concerned, had contacted Child Protective Services. An investigation was launched. Investigators, now armed with the doctor's suspicions, searched the Ibarra home. They found a collection of syringes and other medical paraphernalia. They uncovered Hope's diary and her computer history. Her online searches told a damning story. She had been researching the exact amount of drain cleaner needed to cause severe reactions without being fatal. The most damning evidence, however, came from Hope herself. During a controlled hospital visit, which was being secretly recorded, Hope was observed injecting a substance into her daughter's foreline. When confronted, her web of lies finally unraveled. She confessed. She admitted to the doctors and investigators that she had been poisoning her daughter for years. Her explanation was chilling in its pathological clarity. She did it for the attention. She admitted she was addicted to the sympathy she received as the mother of a sick child. The feeling of being needed, of being seen as a hero, was a high she could not live without. Hope Ibarra was arrested and charged with causing serious bodily injury to a child. The online community that had once hailed her as a saint was left in horrified shock, forced to confront the reality that their well-intentioned support had been the fuel for a monstrous deception. They had been unwitting accomplices in the torture of a little girl. In 2010, Hope Ibarra pleaded guilty. She was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Her daughter, finally free from the source of her illness, began to heal. Physically, she recovered remarkably quickly once the poisoning stopped. The psychological scars, however, would be a lifelong burden. She had to process the unthinkable reality that her mother, the person who was supposed to protect her, was the source of her greatest pain. The case of Hope Ibarra is a deeply disturbing look at the dark symbiosis that can exist between a pathological narcissist and the architecture of the internet. The online world did not create her illness, but it provided the perfect ecosystem for it to flourish. It gave her a stage, an audience, and a constant stream of the emotional currency she craved. She was a predator who did not use a mask or a fake name in the traditional sense. Her mask was the persona of a loving mother. Her deadly game was a slow, calculated poisoning, played out for an audience of strangers who believed they were witnessing a tragedy, when in fact, they were watching a crime. Her story is a testament to the fact that the hunger for attention in the digital age can become so ravenous that a person will sacrifice anything to feed Idavan, their own child. In each of these stories, the digital world served as a veil, a place where predators could craft realities to trap their victims. Whether for love, for control, for a thrill, or for sympathy, the game was the same: to manipulate perception until the line between the screen and the real world was erased, often with fatal consequences. These cases remind us that behind every profile, every message, and every curated life, there is a human being with all the capacity for connection, but also for deception and darkness. The greatest defense we have is vigilance and the sobering awareness that some games should never be played. Thank you for joining us at the Crime Folio. Sleep well and stay safe.